Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Peters, and we are going to be starting a brand new read aloud this week. It is Poppy. I don't know how many times I've read it, so many times that my book is like almost falling apart. It was written by Avi, who writes lots of good kids' books, and Poppy is actually part of a series as well. Although it's not the first book in the series, I think it might be kind of in the middle, but it's the first one I knew about, the first one I read. And so I always like to read it to my students. So let me read the blurb on the back. It says, the Gray House mice need a hero. At the very edge of Dimwood Forest stood an old charred oak. A great horned owl waited there. With his piercing gaze, he surveyed the lands he called his own, watching for the creatures he considered his subjects. None of them dared cross his path until the terrible night when two little mice went dancing in the moonlight. And with that, before we go on, I want to introduce you to Dimwood Forest. So this is the area that this entire story, beginning to end, is going to happen. I have included a couple of arrows on the screen. The first part happens in an area called Bannock. We won't be back there after the first chapter until the very end of the book. And then the second chapter happens in Gray House, which is fairly close to Bannock. But by the time we get done with this adventure, we will be all over Dimwood Forest. So with that, let's go ahead and read chapter 1, Mr. Okax. A thin crescent moon, high in the sky, shed faint white light over Dimwood Forest. Stars glowed. Breezes full of ripe summer fragrances floated over nearby meadow and hill. Dimwood itself, veiled in darkness, lay utterly still. At the very edge of this forest stood an old charred oak on which sat a great horned owl. The owl's name was Mr. Okax, and he looked like death himself. Mr. Okax's eyes, flat upon his face, were round and yellow with large ebony pupils that enabled him to see as few other creatures could. Moonlight, even faint moonlight, was as good as daylight for him. With his piercing gaze, Mr. Okax surveyed the lands he called his own, watching for the comings and goings of the creatures he considered his subjects and his dinners. He looked at Glitter Creek, home to the fish he found so appetizing, the tar road, across which tasty rabbits were known to hop, Jay's Wood, where meaty chipmunks sometimes skittered before dawn. By swiveling his head, he searched the marsh for a savory frog, then Newfield, where, usually, he could count on a delicious vole or two. He looked at Gray House, where Farmer Lemout used to live, then upon the old orchard. He even looked nervously toward Newhouse, but nowhere did he see a thing to eat. Profoundly annoyed, Mr. Okax was beginning to think he would have no dinner that night. But finally, there, near the top of Bannock Hill, where the ponderosa pines had all been cut, where only a few struggling saplings and bushes grew, he saw movement. Just the glimmer of food was enough to cause his owl's heart to pound, his curved black beak to clack, his feathered horns to stand up tall. Mr. Okax shifted his head from right to left, forward and back. When he did so, he beheld 2 mice. They were the best eating, to be sure, but better still, they were the most fearful, and Mr. Okax found deep satisfaction in having others afraid of him. And here, after a wait of nearly the whole night, were 2 savory subjects to terrify before he ate them. One of the 2, a deer mouse, crouched cautiously beneath a length of rotten bark. The other, a golden mouse, stood in the open on his hind legs, his short tail sticking straight out behind him for balance. From his left ear, an earring dangled. In his paws, he held a hazelnut. It's not as if I haven't warned these mice, Mr. Okax murmured to himself. If they will move about without my permission, they've only themselves to blame for the consequences. As he leaned forward, his sharp as needles talons 4 to each large claw and jet black at their tips, cut deeply into the branch he was perched on. Catching these 2 mice, he mused, is going to be fun. On Bannock Hill, the golden mouse turned to his timid companion and said, "Poppy girl, this hazelnut is bad to the bone. Bet you see to sap there's more it came from. Come on out and dig." "Ragweed," Poppy replied as she sniffed tensely in all directions. "You promised we'd dance when we got here. We can't do it in the open. Besides, I want to answer your question. So will you please get under here with me?" Ragweed laughed. "Dude, you must think I'm as dull as a dormouse. You must want to get some of this nut." "I don't want any of your precious nut," Poppy insisted. "I want to give you my answer. And I want to dance. Isn't that the reason we came up to the hill? Only it's not safe out there." "Oh, tell me about it." "You heard my father's warnings," Poppy went on. "It's Mr. Oacax. He might be watching and listening." "Get off," Ragweed sneered. "Your pop talks about that Oacax dude just to scare you and keep you under control." "Ragweed," Poppy cried, "that's ridiculous. Mr. Oacax does rule Dimwood, so we have to ask his permission to be here. And you know perfectly well we never did." "Dude, I'm not going to spend my life asking an old owl's okay every time I want to have fun. Know what I'm saying? This is our moment, girl, right? And now that I've dug this nut up, I'm going to enjoy it. Besides," he said, "it's too dark for an old owl to see me." Poppy. I hope you can see that little picture. You see the owl there. "Poppy," Mr. Oacax scoffed under his breath. "Ragweed. What stupid names mice have. Now, if only that deer mouse will move just a little farther out from under cover, I'll be able to snare both mice at once." The mere thought of such a double catch made Mr. Oacax hiss with pleasure. Then he clacked his beak, spread his wings, and rose into the night air. Up he circled, his fluted flight feathers beating the air silently. High above Bannock Hill, he looked down. The golden mouse, the one eating the nut, was still in the open. So brazen, so foolish. Nevertheless, Mr. Oacax decided to hold back another moment to see if the deer mouse might budge. "Ragweed," Poppy pleaded, "please get under here." "Girl," Ragweed said, "do you know what your problem is? You let your tail lead the way." Poppy, hurt and wanting to show she was not a coward, poked her nose and her whiskers out from under the bark. "Ragweed," she persisted, even as she began to creep into the open, "being careless is stupid." Her friend took another scrape of the nut and sighed with pleasure. "Poppy," he said, "you may be my best girl, but admit it, you don't know how to live like I do." Poppy took 2 more steps beyond the bark. Just then, Mr. Oacax pulled his wings close to his body and plunged. In an instant, he was right above and behind the 2 mice. Once there, he threw out his wings to break his speed, pulled back his head to protect his eyes, and thrust his claws forward and wide like grappling hooks to pounce. It was Poppy who saw him. "Ragweed!" She shrieked in terror as she hurled herself back under cover. "It's Oacax!" But the owl was already upon them. Down came his right claw. It scratched the tip of Poppy's nose. Down came his left claw. It was more successful, clamping around Ragweed's head and neck like a vice of needles, killing him instantly. The next moment, the owl soared back up into the air. A lifeless Ragweed, earring glittering in the moonlight, hung from a claw. As for the hazelnut, it fell to the earth like a cold stone. Powerful but leisurely strokes brought Mr. Oacax back to his watching tree. Once there, he shifted the dead ragweed from talon to beak in one gulp. The mouse disappeared down his throat, earring and all. His hunger momentarily satisfied, Mr. Oakhacks tilted back his head and let forth a long, low cry of triumph. Hoo! Hoo! Poppy did not hear the call. In her terror, she had fainted. Now she lay unconscious beneath the length of rotten bark. The owl did not mind. He had enjoyed the first mouse so much he decided to wait for the second. Indeed, Mr. Oakhacks was not entirely sorry that Poppy had escaped. She was terrified, and he enjoyed that. And for sure, he would get her soon. Oh, yes, he murmured to himself, mice are the most fun to catch. Then Mr. Oakhacks did that rare thing for an owl. He smiled. And that is the end of chapter 1. Kind of a rough beginning, huh? A little bit shocking. But we'll see what happens next. And see you next time.